Hello everyone. Today I begin my two-part series explaining and evaluating the most popular forms of the Kalam Cosmological argument. The Kalam Cosmological argument is all too often covered by Christian apologists, but I don't see many openly scholastic figures discussing it in detail, at least here on YouTube. With that in mind, let's jump right in. The major premise in William Lane Craig's formulation is, quote, "Whatever begins to exist has a cause," end quote. Immediately, that should shut down the straw man that this argument says that all things have a cause. Instead, this premise is that anything that begins to exist has some cause of its being. Craig argues that this premise seems obviously true, at least insofar as we intuitively believe that something cannot come into existence from nothing. It's very odd to suppose that the universe simply popped into existence unprompted from absolute non-being. This is to say that there was no potency to be actualized, such that the universe was merely formed, but that there was no passive potency whatsoever. We don't experience any objects in the world pop into existence randomly, so why would the universe behave so? If it were possible for things to pop into existence out of nothing, we would expect to see such events very often, but we don't. This premise is simply an application of the principle that being cannot come from non-being. Some will say that quantum physics creates a situation in which something can come into being out of nothing, as at the subatomic level there are, quote, virtual particles that arise from non-being. If this interpretation were correct, then we'd have sufficient evidence to suggest that the universe could, in principle, begin to exist without a cause. However, this interpretation of quantum physics is questionable, as not all physicists are satisfied with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. Further, even on this account, this doesn't entail that subatomic particles actually rise from nothing, but instead arise as the spontaneous fluctuations of a subatomic vacuum, which is sufficient explanation for the indeterministic nature of these subatomic particles appearing out of seemingly nowhere. So to clarify this premise, we'll say that something x begins to exist if and only if x comes into being at time t. However, we need to acknowledge the significant danger that the tenseless theory of time holds. The B theory of time says that all moments of time are equally existent, so it's improper to say that anything begins to exist. The universe exists as a kind of four-dimensional space-time block or object, so all moments of times are equal in existential value. If the B theory of time is true, then the universe can't begin to exist because there's no first event per se. This situation is just like a meter stick, as you don't say that a meter stick begins to exist in virtue of it having some for a centimeter. Therefore, if the B theory of time is correct, speaking of the universe's beginning is incoherent. Craig's formulation of the Kalam cosmological argument is thus necessarily dependent on some formulation of the A theory of time, which says that temporal becoming is an objective feature of reality. One can read Craig's works on time to see his rigorous defenses of the A theory, but suffice it to say that he develops a few arguments in support. The primary critique that I can cover here concerns the coherence of tensed language and its necessity in conveying information. Craig argues that A theory is the proper intuition of reality, as language indicates. It's very tough to create a tenseless language, as there is different information conveyed in tense sentences compared to tenseless translations of said sentences. Richard Gale gives the following example. Suppose some soldiers are watching for enemy troops to advance on their position. At 4 p.m., one of the soldiers sees enemies coming his way. In a tense theory of language, he calls his commanding officer saying, "The enemies are approaching." Assuming the commanding officer is a rational actor, which is not a difficult assumption in this case, the commanding officer will send soldiers over immediately. Under the same circumstances, but with tenseless language, the soldier would say, "There are soldiers approaching my position at 4 p.m. The commanding officer would then need to examine a local clock and then send soldiers over. In effect, tensed language contains information concerning the experience of presentness, which tenseless language does not. This argument is a part of a broader one that the B theory of time requires one to entirely remove one's basic intuitions about reality, concluding that our experience of time is illusory in some way. Of course, there are some forms of B theory that are immune to this, such as the one advocated by Alexander Pruss and Dr. Nigel Cundy, but most versions of B theory that I find are going to be affected by this critique. So to summarize, premise 1 simply suggests that something that begins to exist has a cause, where beginning to exist is effectively having a finite temporal history, but this premise relies significantly on the tense theory of time. The minor premise in Craig's argument is that the universe began to exist, which he defends both philosophically and scientifically. We should note that when Craig uses the word universe, he means all space, time, matter, and material objects. First, Craig defends the idea that the universe began by arguing that an actual infinity is impossible. This argument may be summarized as follows. An actual infinite cannot exist, but an infinite temporal regress of physical events is an actual infinite. Therefore, an infinite temporal regress of physical events cannot exist. To clarify, an actual infinite is any collection or set that includes at least one definite and discrete number above any natural number. This stands in contrast to a potential infinite, which is any collection or set that has at least one definite and discrete number equal to some natural number which approaches infinity as a limit. Immediately, we must note that set theory does not disprove Craig's argument, as an actual infinite may be a useful concept within the abstract, but it isn't possibly transposed in the actual spatiotemporal world. To illustrate why an actual infinite cannot exist, Craig gives a few paradoxes. First, he gives the Hilbert's hotel paradox, where there's a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are taken. When a new guest arrives asking for a room, the front desk moves each individual from each room over one room. So the individual occupying room 1 moves to room 2, the individual in room 2 to room 3, and so on. Thus, room 1 becomes vacant even though the rooms were supposed to be full in the first place. Even more confusingly, let's suppose an infinite number of guests arrive and ask to move in. The front desk moves every person from their room to the room double their own. So the individual in room 1 moves to room 2, the individual in room 2 to room 4, so on and so forth. All the guests that were already occupying rooms now arrive in even-numbered rooms, so all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant. Yet before this all occurred, the rooms were supposedly full, so once all the guests have checked in, there's also the same number of guests, an infinite amount. On a simpler note, if someone checks out of the hotel, are there fewer guests in the hotel? There are still infinite guests. Craig further argues that we cannot traverse an infinite distance of any kind. Jacobus Erasmus summarizes as follows. For there to be an infinite past, then an actually infinite number of days has occurred, and infinite time has been traversed. But if there's an infinite past, then we cannot traverse the history of the universe. To traverse this infinite sequence is to mean that we go through each member of the sequence, in this case, each day in the history of the universe, one member at a time. A sequence is thus traversed completely where every member has been singled out at a unique time. For example, let's say that someone wants to count through all natural numbers at a pace of one number per second. Clearly, someone would never be able to reach the number infinity, as every second there would be another number that could be counted. Craig also likes to defend premise 2 by appealing to modern cosmology. Prior to the Big Bang, there was not a state of nothingness, but absolute nothingness. We want to be careful and recognize that the concept of nothingness isn't some positive state of affairs that's very limited, but truly the negation of being. Therefore, if the Big Bang is accurately called the beginning of the universe, then we can say that the universe began to exist. Of course, I'm not here to defend or critique Craig's view of the age of the universe, but please note that such a theological objection to this argument exists. Even if one disagrees with Craig's view on the age of the Earth, this argument can be used to prove a contradiction. In effect, one could say that if you deny young Earth creationism, you must still believe in God, and God has revealed that the universe is young. Again, not saying this is something I would do, or that I deny, but it's a possibility. Craig argues that the standard hot Big Bang model proves that the universe began to exist, where existence is at least considered to be some kind of extramental reality. He writes, quote, according to the Friedmann-Lemaitre model, that as time proceeds, the distances separating the ideal particles of the cosmological fluid constituted by the matter and energy of the universe become greater, end quote. This is to say that space itself is expanding, not merely that material objects within space are growing. The implication here is that as one reverses the expansion and extrapolates back in time, the universe becomes progressively denser until we arrive at some state of infinite density sometime in the finite past. This state would thus be a singularity where space-time curvature itself becomes infinite alongside temperature, pressure, and density. This singularity at some time in the past is not in space-time, but is actually an edge or boundary to it, meaning that there is a beginning to both space and time. I'll link some resources that continue the scientific arguments because they are very deep, such that a video on this would be a bit too long, and the topics would be very confusing because you guys need to reread this stuff many times to understand it. But I can try to cover that material if you guys really want me to. To summarize, though, the Kalam cosmological argument is as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now that we've defined and defended premises 1 and 2, though there are surely more arguments for premise 2, we can touch on the divine attributes. First, this entity must be outside of space and time, as space and time began in the universe. Craig has another work where he argues that God actually enters time when he creates the universe, a view I have significant problems with and will actually cover in the future. But for the sake of this, Craig is saying that time is not prior to the entity, for this entity created it. That would make this entity quite powerful. Second, this entity must be uncaused. Craig says that because there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, there shouldn't be a cause of this entity. He uses Occam's razor to say that one could posit a plurality of causes prior to this entity, but they're redundant and hence they are highly unlikely. To be uncaused is also to be beginningless, so this entity is beginningless as well. Third, Craig says that this entity is immutable, which I find really interesting. He says that the changelessness is rooted in the fact that this entity is outside of space and time, though as I mentioned earlier, there are works where he says that this entity would enter time. I'm curious to see if in more modern publications he's said that this is different, or he has critiqued this argument, but at least from the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology and a few other works that I have researched, he says that this entity is immutable. This entity is immaterial because to be material is to be mutable. Most importantly for Craig, this entity is personal, so to say that there's some entity that is immaterial, beginningless, uncaused, timeless, and spaceless leaves either an unembodied mind or an abstract object like a number, set, proposition, etc. However, abstract objects don't enter the kind of causal relation required to create the universe, therefore this entity should be an unembodied mind. This entity is what we mean when we say the word God, therefore God exists. There are a few objections that we can respond to here. First, Graham Oppy says that the paradox set up in Hilbert's Hotel is simply what we'd expect from such an event, so we're effectively setting up a situation that is itself weird. I'm honestly not sure how this is much of an objection, as it appears just to be biting the bullet. Craig has responded to this by saying that this is his whole point, so it's not an objection at all. There were also some scientific objections that I've seen, but they're really complex and don't touch on the main focus of this video, which was philosophical. Again, Craig and others address such arguments in the resources that I'll be providing in today's notes. Some will say, as mentioned earlier, that this doesn't work with young Earth creationism because it relies on Big Bang cosmology. But as I said earlier, the creationist could simply say that this shows an inconsistency in the atheist's worldview. Now, my objections or concerns are as follows. I think the argument works at the end of the day, and it's a really good argument to make in an elevator to someone, but when someone investigates it more and more, it becomes heavily dependent on paradoxes of infinity and specific interpretations of physics. Personally, I don't like to use arguments that require me to understand high-level physics, because that's simply not my degree, and most people would have trouble understanding it as well. I'm also not wholly sold on the A theory of time. I would prefer a form of this argument that is not dependent on the A theory, especially as Craig himself says that to have the A theory, we need to alter our understanding of relativity to be neo-Lorentzian as opposed to Einsteinian, which is a very large ontological commitment. I also think that divine attributes aren't as strongly as established as Craig would like. I think he's right regarding the abstract objects, but I find it difficult to say why this abstract entity is the god of Christianity as opposed to the god of other religions, or the god of deism. Any argument that requires the use of Occam's razor to establish God's unicity is weak to me. This doesn't mean the argument necessarily fails, but that it isn't the best it could be, or it's not as good as other arguments that are out there. Most importantly, I think that there are simply better forms of this argument, which I'll cover soon. Overall, this formulation of the Kalam Cosmological argument is entirely fine. It will convince some people, won't convince others, and that's just how it is. I prefer arguments that don't require as strong of ontological commitments, but Kalam's philosophical arguments require us to deny actual infinites, and we must absolutely presuppose an A theory of time. So use this argument as you want, but I personally don't most of the time. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.